The storm had been rolling across the Appalachian hills all afternoon, dark clouds stretching so low they seemed to swallow the ridges whole. I had driven out from Pittsburgh, looking for some peace and quiet at my uncle's farmhouse, a place I hadn't visited in nearly a decade. The road wound through narrow valleys, slick with rain, flanked by dark, wet trees that bent under the wind. By the time I reached the farmhouse, the first sheets of rain were hammering the roof and drumming on the porch, and the wind had started to tug at the old shutters like it was trying to tear them loose. The house was empty except for me, quiet except for the storm and the occasional groan of the old floorboards. I had spent summers here as a child, but alone, it felt different. Alive in a way I couldn't place. I unpacked my bag in the guest bedroom on the second floor and tried to focus on a book I'd brought, but the house seemed to hum with tension, every board creaking and shifting in response to the gusting wind outside. By 6 o'clock, the rain had turned from light to relentless sheets. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the house and casting the narrow hallways in stark, unnatural angles. Thunder followed almost instantly, shaking the floors and rattling the windows. The power flickered and then went out completely, leaving me in darkness. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter, its weak beam cutting only a small path ahead. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, bending along the walls with every flash of lightning. That's when I heard it, a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway that led to the bedrooms. My stomach tightened. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding rain. Drag, scrape, drag, scrape. It stopped, then started again, slow, heavy, deliberate. I told myself it was a branch blown against the house, or maybe a raccoon trapped inside, but the rhythm of the noise didn't match anything natural. I gripped the flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The sound stopped. Silence pressed down so heavily I could hear my own heartbeat. And then I heard it. Unmistakable. Ethan. My name, whispered softly, almost in my ear. I spun, swinging the flashlight wildly, but the hallway was empty. Shadows stretched in the flickering lightning, bending into impossible shapes along the walls. I felt the oppressive weight of being watched press down on me, heavy and suffocating. I knew I had to see what was happening upstairs. The house's second floor had 3 bedrooms and a small study. Nobody should have been there. But the footsteps began again, slow, deliberate pacing across the floor above. They paused, then continued, echoing with an authority that made my blood run cold. I gripped the railing and began climbing the stairs, flashlight shaking in my hand. Each step groaned under my weight. At the top, the hallway stretched ahead, dark and oppressive. Doors to the bedrooms closed except one, the one at the end, slightly ajar. I pointed the flashlight toward it. Shadows danced along the walls in distorted shapes with each flicker of lightning. Then I saw it, a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, standing motionless at first, outlined against the window light. My chest tightened, breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see a face, only a shape, but it radiated something unnatural, something cold. The voice came again, low and commanding. Leave. I ran. Down the hallway, down the stairs, tripping, nearly losing the flashlight. The storm hit me the instant I burst through the front door, rain soaking me instantly, wind lashing against my clothes. I didn't stop until I reached my car, heart hammering, soaked through. I glanced back once. The house sat silent, normal in the daylight, but I knew better. I drove to a motel 20 miles away, sitting in the parking lot, watching the storm rage over the hills. Every flash of lightning brought the shadow back in my mind, gliding silently down the hallway, whispering my name. I never returned to that house alone. Even years later, storms in western Pennsylvania bring the same dread, the same pressure, the sensation of being watched. On dark, restless nights, I sometimes see the figure at the top of the stairs, patient, silent, waiting just beyond the reach of the light. Storms are never just storms anymore. They are reminders of that night and of the presence that claimed that house long before I arrived. Some things, once seen, never leave. Story the end. The storm had been building all day. A low, rolling darkness that seemed almost alive as it pushed across the hills surrounding my childhood home in western Pennsylvania. I had driven out from Pittsburgh to spend the weekend at my uncle's farmhouse, a place I hadn't visited in nearly 10 years. The road twisted through dense woods, slick with rain, and the wind rattled the old tin roof of the farmhouse before I even got out of the car. By the time I reached the porch, the first sheets of rain were slamming against the house, and the wind had started tugging at the shutters like it wanted to pry them off. Inside, the house was empty and quiet, except for the storm. I unpacked my bag in the guest bedroom on the second floor, trying to ignore the unease that had settled over me. The house had always creaked and groaned, but alone, it felt alive in a way I hadn't remembered. Every floorboard shifted beneath my weight, and even small gusts of wind through the cracks in the windows made the house feel like it was breathing. By 6 o'clock, the storm had grown violent, lightning stabbing across the sky, and thunder crashing almost immediately after. The power flickered once, and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter, its narrow beam barely illuminating the kitchen, and tried to focus on the book I had brought. That's when I heard it, a dragging, scraping noise coming from the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I froze. Drag, scrape, drag, scrape. It stopped, then started again. My mind raced through every logical explanation. Branches blown against the siding, a raccoon trapped inside, the house settling, but none of it felt right. The rhythm, the weight of the steps, it was deliberate. Someone or something was moving upstairs. Then I heard my name, whispered softly, almost in my ear. Ethan. My blood ran cold. I spun, flashlight swinging, but the hallway was empty. Shadows stretched along the walls in strange angles, contorting with the flickering lightning. The oppressive feeling of being watched pressed down on me. I knew I had to investigate, though every instinct screamed to run. The footsteps began again, slow, measured, pacing across the second-floor hallway. They stopped, then resumed, echoing with a rhythm that made my stomach tighten. I gripped the railing and began climbing the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. At the top, the hallway stretched into darkness. All the bedroom doors were closed except the one at the far end, slightly ajar. I pointed the flashlight toward it. Shadows twisted and danced along the walls in the lightning flashes. Then I saw it. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, standing motionless at the end of the hall. My chest tightened. I couldn't see a face, only a silhouette, but it radiated something unnatural, cold. The voice came again, low, commanding. Leave. I bolted. Down the hallway, down the stairs, nearly tripping as the flashlight swung wildly. The storm hit me as soon as I reached the front door, rain soaking me instantly, wind tearing at my clothes. I didn't stop until I reached my car, heart hammering, soaked to the bone. I glanced back once. The house sat silent, normal in the daylight, but I knew better. Something had been there. Something was still there. I drove to a motel 20 miles away and sat in the parking lot, watching the storm rage over the hills. Every flash of lightning brought the shadow back in my mind, gliding silently down the hall, whispering my name. I never returned to that house alone. Even years later, storms bring back the same dread, the same feeling of being watched. On restless, stormy nights, I sometimes see the figure at the top of the stairs, patient, silent, waiting just beyond the reach of the light. Storms are never just storms anymore. They are reminders of that night and of the presence that claimed that house long before I arrived. Some things once seen never leave. Story the end. The storm started in the late afternoon, a relentless curtain of rain pushing across the hills of western Pennsylvania. I had driven out from Pittsburgh to my uncle's farmhouse in Cedar Hollow, a place I hadn't visited in years. The road wound through thick woods, slick with rain, and the wind tugged at the car as if warning me to turn back. By the time I pulled onto the long gravel driveway, the first sheets of rain were hammering the roof of the farmhouse, and the old oaks lining the path bent violently, their limbs thrashing in the wind. The house was quiet, except for the storm. Empty. Familiar, yet unsettling. I unpacked my bag in the guest bedroom on the second floor, trying to focus on a book I had brought. Every floorboard groaned beneath my feet, responding to the wind and the storm outside. The farmhouse, built in the late 1800s, had always felt alive, but alone it felt like it was watching. By 6 o'clock, the lightning was flashing almost continuously, illuminating the house in stark, blinding bursts. Thunder followed, deep and resonant, shaking the floors and rattling the windows. The power flickered and went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter, the beam weak but enough to cut through the blackness. Shadows twisted along the walls, elongated and distorted with each flash of lightning. Then I heard it. A dragging sound, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Drag, scrape. It stopped, then started again. My heart pounded. I told myself it was a branch blown against the siding, or maybe a raccoon trapped inside. But the weight, the rhythm, the deliberate pacing, it didn't belong to nature. I stepped cautiously into the hallway, flashlight shaking in my hand. The sound ceased entirely. Silence pressed down on me, heavier than the darkness itself. And then I heard it again, my name whispered softly, almost in my ear. Ethan. My blood ran cold. I spun, swinging the flashlight wildly, but the hallway was empty. Shadows danced along the walls in impossible angles, bending with each flicker of lightning. A suffocating feeling pressed down on me, heavy and oppressive. I knew I had to see what was happening upstairs, though every instinct screamed not to. The footsteps began again, slow, deliberate, pacing across the second-floor hallway. They stopped, then resumed, echoing with a precision that made my stomach knot. I gripped the railing and started up the stairs, each creak of the wood announcing my approach. At the top, the hallway stretched ahead, dark and oppressive. All the bedroom doors were closed except one, the one at the far end, slightly ajar. I pointed the flashlight toward it. Shadows twisted and stretched in the flickering light. Then I saw it, a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, standing motionless at first, outlined by the faint glow from the window. My chest tightened. I couldn't see a face, only a shadowy silhouette, but it radiated something unnatural, something cold and deliberate. The voice came again, low and commanding, "Leave." I ran. Down the hallway, down the stairs, tripping as the flashlight swung wildly. The storm hit me the instant I stepped outside, rain soaking me instantly, wind tearing at my clothes. I didn't stop until I reached my car, trembling, soaked through, heart hammering. I glanced back once. The house sat silent, ordinary in daylight, but I knew it wasn't empty. I drove to a motel 20 miles away and sat in the parking lot, watching the storm rage over the hills. Every flash of lightning brought the shadow back in my mind, gliding silently down the hall, whispering my name. I never returned to that house alone. Even years later, storms in Cedar Hollow bring the same dread, the same pressure, the sensation of being watched. On dark, restless nights, I sometimes see the figure at the top of the stairs, patient, silent, waiting just beyond the reach of the light. Storms are never just storms anymore. They are reminders of that night and of the presence that claimed that house long before I arrived. Some things, once seen, never leave. Story the end. The first thing I noticed about that night was the wind. It came in long, hollow gusts that rattled the windows and made the old shutters bang against the siding of the house. I was 23, back in my hometown of Bramblewood, Pennsylvania, staying at my aunt's house while she visited relatives out of state. The house had been empty for weeks, and my parents thought it would be safe for me to stay there alone. I thought it would be peaceful. I was wrong. The storm had started in the late afternoon. Thick clouds rolled in over the ridges, swallowing the sunlight and leaving the valley in a gray gloom. By 6 o'clock, the rain began in earnest, coming down in sheets that hammered against the roof and pooled along the sides of the house. I had unpacked my bag, made a cup of coffee, and settled into the living room, trying to lose myself in an old paperback novel I had found on the shelf. The storm seemed to press against the windows, and the wind whispered through the trees in ways that made the old house groan and creak. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just the storm. Around 8 o'clock, the power flickered and went out completely. Darkness pressed into the room, heavy and cold. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter, the beam cutting a narrow path through the shadows. The house felt different in the dark, smaller, tighter, more oppressive. Every creak, every rattle of the windows seemed deliberate, as if the house itself were alive and watching. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the pounding of the rain, a slow, dragging noise coming from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. My stomach twisted. I froze, straining to hear over the storm. There it was again. Drag, a slow movement along the floor. I tried to convince myself it was a branch blown against the house, or maybe a raccoon trapped inside. But the sound was too deliberate, too heavy, too human. I gripped the flashlight and stepped toward the hallway. Each step made the floorboards groan under my weight, announcing my approach. The dragging stopped. Silence fell, and my heart thumped in my chest. Then I heard it. A whisper, soft, low, unmistakable. "Ethan," I spun, flashlight swinging, but the hallway was empty. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, nerves making the storm louder and darker than it was. But the feeling of being watched pressed down on me, heavier than the darkness itself. I knew I had to move. I needed to check the upstairs. My aunt's house had a second floor with 3 bedrooms and a small study. Nobody was supposed to be up there. I gripped the railing and began climbing the stairs, each step creaking and moaning under my weight. The wind outside howled, shaking the windows, and every flash of lightning threw long, twisted shadows across the walls. Halfway up, I froze. Footsteps, slow and heavy, were pacing along the hallway above. They were deliberate, measured, and echoing against the wooden floors. I tried to tell myself it was the house settling, but the steps moved with intent, coming closer, then pausing, then continuing. When I reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out ahead, dark and oppressive. I swept the flashlight across the doors. Bedrooms closed, the study door slightly ajar. That's when I saw it, a shadow at the far end of the hall. Tall, thin, standing perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see a face, only the shape outlined against the flickering light of a distant lightning strike. I backed away toward the stairs. The shadow moved closer, gliding silently, impossibly. My pulse pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. The voice came again, barely a whisper but clear. "Leave." I didn't argue. I ran. Down the stairs 2 at a time, nearly slipping on the old wood. I bolted through the living room, past the kitchen, and out the front door into the rain. The storm hit me like a wall, soaking my clothes instantly, but I didn't care. I kept running to my car, shivering, trying to catch my breath. When I looked back, the house sat silent, normal in the daylight, but I knew it wasn't empty. I spent the rest of the night in a motel, watching the storm from a safe distance. Every flash of lightning brought back the memory of that shadow, that whisper, the heavy, deliberate footsteps upstairs. I never returned to that house alone. Even years later, when a storm rolls over Bramblewood, I feel the same dread, the same sensation of being watched. I've driven past that house countless times. On dark, stormy nights, I sometimes see a figure at the top of the stairs, watching, waiting, always patient, always silent, always there. Story the end. The storm started slowly at first, a distant rumble rolling over the hills, a flicker of lightning far across the horizon. I had been driving most of the day, cutting through the back roads of rural Pennsylvania, heading to a small cabin my grandfather had left me on the outskirts of a tiny, nearly forgotten town. The roads were slick from earlier rain, and by the time I turned onto the long, winding drive to the cabin, the clouds had thickened into a dark, oppressive ceiling, blotting out any remnants of daylight. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter as the wind picked up, shaking my old sedan with sudden gusts that made the car sway. A branch slammed against the hood, startling me, and I nearly ran off the side of the road. Every mile felt longer than the last, as if the storm itself was stretching the night out before me. When I finally arrived, the gravel crunching under my tires, the cabin looked deserted, isolated, and more menacing than I remembered from the photographs my grandfather had shown me. Its porch light flickered in the growing darkness, a weak beacon that barely cut through the sheets of rain. I stepped out, my boots sinking into the muddy path, and pulled the door open. The sound of wind and rain momentarily replaced by the hollow silence of the cabin's interior. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and mildew, the kind of odor that makes you feel like the air itself has weight. I dropped my bag and lit a few lamps, the warm glow offering comfort against the oppressive darkness pressing at the windows. The first hour passed quietly. I unpacked, made some coffee, and tried to settle in. But even with the lights on, the storm outside seemed to have a presence, a kind of restless energy that made the walls feel alive. Every gust rattled the windows. Every crack of thunder shook the floorboards, and every shadow seemed to stretch just beyond where it should. Around 9 o'clock I heard it, a faint tapping at the front door. 3 soft taps, deliberate, like someone knocking with patience and purpose. I froze, listening, heart pounding, and whispered, "Hello?" My own voice sounded foreign in the stillness. The taps didn't stop, and I felt a cold prickle run down my spine. I approached the door slowly, flashlight in hand, and peered through the glass. The porch was empty. Nothing moved except the rain and the branches of a nearby tree, bending under the wind. I shut the door and bolted it, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching. I returned to the living room and tried to distract myself with a book, but the words blurred on the page. My attention kept snapping to the hallway leading upstairs, to the closed doors, to the corners that the lamplight couldn't reach. And then I heard it, a faint, soft creaking like footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floorboards above me. I froze. There should have been no one else here. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The footsteps moved closer, then paused, then resumed, pacing as if counting each step. I wanted to call out, to demand whoever was there show themselves, but my voice caught in my throat. I grabbed a heavy candle holder from the mantel, my makeshift weapon, and inched toward the stairs. The steps above stopped, silence, then the faintest whisper, so soft I thought I imagined it. My turn. The words made my skin crawl. I backed up, heart hammering, and the whisper repeated, closer this time. My turn. A flash of lightning illuminated the hallway, and I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the upstairs landing. Its head tilted unnaturally, long hair plastered to its pale, almost gray face. The eyes, dark and empty, fixed on me with a weight that made it impossible to look away. The lightning faded, and the figure vanished. I stumbled back, nearly falling, and ran to the kitchen, locking the door behind me. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, the silence had become oppressive. I huddled near the counter, listening, waiting for the next sound. Hours seemed to stretch impossibly long. At some point, exhaustion claimed me, and I slept fitfully on the kitchen floor, and a blanket wrapped tightly around me. I awoke to a different silence. The storm had passed, leaving only the occasional drip of water from the eaves. I dared to move, checking each room. Everything seemed normal, undisturbed, and yet I knew I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched lingered, a weight pressing on my chest, making every step tentative. Then I noticed the footprints, wet, dark, and too large to be mine, leading from the front door to the base of the stairs. I hadn't gone outside. No one had entered. My blood ran cold. I packed a bag and left immediately, driving until the town lights appeared, until I felt the presence begin to fade with distance. I didn't return for weeks. When I finally did, the cabin was quiet, normal in appearance. The footprints had vanished. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the sense of anticipation remained, a subtle hum in the air that I couldn't shake. Storms continued to follow me in a way that felt personal. Each one brought the memory of that night, the figure at the landing, the whispers, the footsteps. I began sleeping with lights on, checking locks obsessively, refusing to stay alone in any house near the woods. The sensation of being watched, of something waiting just out of sight, never truly left me. It wasn't long before I realized that the storm was a trigger, a door. Every time thunder rolled, every time wind rattled against the windows, I felt it. The presence that had followed me from that cabin, patient and unseen, waiting for another stormy night to draw near. I moved to a city apartment eventually, thinking the noise, the neighbors, the constant hum of life would protect me. It didn't. I still wake when storms approach, heart pounding, ears straining for sounds that are never there, or always are, depending on how you measure presence. Shadows flicker at the edges of my vision, subtle but impossible to ignore. Footsteps echo behind me in empty hallways. Soft whispers brush my ears when no one else is near. The cabin sits empty now, the forest around it reclaimed by time and neglect. Yet even from miles away, the knowledge persists. The figure waits, patient, a constant reminder that the world is not as empty as we like to believe, that some places, some nights are doorways, and some storms are invitations. I still drive past those back roads sometimes, but never after dark, never when the clouds are low and thick, and never when the wind starts to howl like it did that first night. Because deep down, I know that if I ever return on a stormy, restless night, the cabin and the presence that inhabits it will be waiting. Patient, silent, watching. And perhaps one day it will finally decide it is its turn again. Story the end. The storm hit just as the sun was disappearing behind the hills outside of Fairview, Ohio. I had driven out to my cousin's old farmhouse, a place I hadn't visited in years. thinking I could spend a quiet weekend alone to catch up on work and clear my head. The sky had been gray all day, low and heavy with rain, and by late afternoon, the first fat drops began to hammer the tin roof, with a fury I hadn't expected. The wind came up fast, gusting through the trees and rattling the shutters. The house, built in the late 1800s, groaned in response, every beam and floorboard echoing the storm's anger. I had spent the afternoon unpacking, setting my laptop on the old oak table in the dining room, and trying to focus on the work I had brought with me. By 6 o'clock, the rain had turned into sheets, slamming against the roof and pooling along the sides of the porch. The sound was deafening. Every flash of lightning lit the yard in stark, brief clarity, and the thunder came so quickly after each flash that the house seemed to shake in response. The power went out around 7:30, and the house went dark all at once, plunging me into a silence that felt heavy, almost physical. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter, its beam cutting a narrow swath through the darkness, and tried to settle back into work. But the storm had changed the house. It felt smaller, tighter, like it was pressing in from all sides. The shadows stretched in strange shapes along the walls, and every groan of the old beams sounded deliberate, like someone or something was moving within them. I had just poured a cup of coffee when I heard it. A scraping noise, faint at first, coming from the hallway that led to the bedrooms upstairs. My stomach clenched. I froze, listening over the rain and wind. There it was again, slow, deliberate, moving along the floor. Drag. Scrape, drag, scrape. The sound stopped and started in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I tried to reason it away. Old houses make noises, maybe something had fallen upstairs, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy to be dismissed as nothing. I gripped the flashlight and cautiously started toward the stairs. Each step creaked loudly in the empty house, announcing my approach. The noise stopped entirely as I reached the base of the stairs. Silence, except for the storm. And then I heard it, soft and low, almost whispering, clearly saying my name. Ethan. I spun, swinging the flashlight, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest, and I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. Surely it was just my imagination, I told myself, nerves exaggerated by the storm and isolation. But the sense of being watched pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, and every instinct in my body screamed that I was not alone. I knew I had to see what was happening upstairs. The house's second floor had been mostly unused for years. Bedrooms locked, doors shut, filled with old furniture and dust. Nobody was supposed to be there. But the footsteps had started again, slow and heavy, pacing across the wooden floors. They paused, then continued, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was moving with a purpose. I gripped the railing and started up the stairs, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step louder than the last. At the top, the hallway stretched out in darkness. The doors to the bedrooms stood closed, one slightly ajar. I pointed the flashlight toward it. Shadows stretched across the walls, bending in strange, unnatural ways with each flicker of lightning. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway. Tall, thin, barely discernible in the dim light. It didn't move at first, only watched. I couldn't see a face, only a form outlined in shadow. My breath caught, and I felt a cold weight press on my chest. I tried to back away, but my feet felt heavy, rooted to the floor. The voice came again, barely audible, but sharp and commanding. Leave. I bolted. Down the hallway, down the stairs, nearly tripping as the flashlight swung wildly. The sound of the storm outside crashed over me as I burst through the front door, rain pelting my skin, soaking my clothes instantly. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, heart racing, chest heaving, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I looked back once. The house sat silent, normal in the daylight, but I knew it wasn't empty. I never stayed there alone again. Even years later, when storms rolled through Fairview, I felt the same dread, the same pressure, the same sensation of being watched. I've driven past that farmhouse countless times. On particularly dark, stormy nights, I sometimes swear I see a figure at the top of the stairs, waiting, patient, silent, just beyond the reach of the light, always watching. Storms, for me, are never just storms anymore. They are reminders of that restless, dark night and of the presence that claimed that house long before I ever walked through its doors. I learned to respect them, to never dismiss the feeling that some things, once seen, never truly leave. The memory of that shadow gliding silently across the hall, whispering my name, will stay with me forever, and every thunderclap brings it back as if it were happening all over again. The house is still there. The fields around it are empty. The lights inside go dark at night, and the shadow waits. Story the end. The storm hit around 7 in the evening, heavy clouds swallowing the last of the daylight, and by the time I turned onto the narrow gravel road leading to the cabin, the rain was coming down in sheets. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend alone in the woods, a chance to escape the city and its constant noise, but the intensity of the storm made the trip feel ominous from the start. My old Ford rumbled over the soaked gravel, each gust of wind making it shake as though the car itself were afraid. The cabin was an old one, built by my grandfather decades ago, sitting on a hill overlooking a small dark lake. Its porch light flickered weakly against the driving rain, casting long, distorted shadows across the porch. I parked and scrambled out of the car, rain soaking through my jacket almost instantly. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, stepping into the musty smell of damp wood and the faint scent of pine from the surrounding forest. I dropped my bag and turned on the few lamps, the glow doing little to chase back the oppressive darkness outside the windows. The storm made the cabin feel smaller, the walls closing in, and the shadows seemed to pulse in rhythm with the winds howling. I told myself it was just my imagination. Storms make people paranoid. I tried to settle in, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat near the fireplace with a book. The rain lashed against the windows, and every gust made the old house groan. Floorboards creaked, the roof shuddered, and the hallway leading upstairs seemed unnaturally dark. Then I heard it, a soft tapping at the front door. 3 slow taps, deliberate, spaced evenly apart. I froze. No one else should be here. No other cabins were close enough to be occupied. My heart pounded in my chest as I whispered, "Hello?" The taps continued, just as slow and deliberate, and I realized I wasn't imagining them. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. The porch was empty. Nothing moved except the rain and the swaying branches of the surrounding trees. I shut the door and bolted it, hands shaking, trying to convince myself it had been the wind. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time was hard to measure in the storm's chaos. I tried to read, tried to focus, but the house felt alive, each creak of the floorboards a footstep. Around midnight, the temperature in the cabin dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the air, and I could feel the presence of something watching. Then I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps upstairs. I froze. My chest tightened. The footsteps paused, then moved again, circling, pacing, deliberate. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. I grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the kitchen for protection and slowly approached the staircase. The steps above stopped. Silence. Then came the whisper, soft and low. "Come, here." I stumbled back, my heart racing, and another flash of lightning illuminated the upstairs hallway. For a brief moment, I saw it. A figure at the top of the stairs, tall and thin, with long dark hair plastered to its pale face. Its head was tilted unnaturally, and its eyes, black and empty, seemed to pierce right through me. The lightning faded, and the figure was gone. I ran to the kitchen, locked the door, and sank to the floor, gripping the skillet and shaking. The storm outside continued to batter the cabin, but the house itself seemed to hum with a restless energy. Hours passed, though I cannot say how many. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I dozed fitfully on the kitchen floor, waking intermittently to the creaks and whispers. Morning came, gray and rainy, and I slowly explored the cabin. Everything appeared normal. The rooms were empty, no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been there. Yet I knew. I had seen the figure. I had felt it. The footprints were there too, wet and dark on the floorboards, leading from the door to the base of the stairs, though no one had entered or exited. I left immediately, driving into the nearest town, the feeling of being watched fading only as I reached the lights and warmth of human habitation. Weeks later, I returned. The cabin seemed normal, untouched. The footprints were gone, nothing moved, and yet the oppressive presence remained. Over time, I realized that the storm was a trigger, a door that allowed the presence to cross over, to become tangible. Every storm that rolled through the area since that night has carried with it the same oppressive feeling, the same whispers and footsteps that haunt my memory. I no longer stay alone in isolated places during storms. I avoid cabins, backroads, and forests during thunder and lightning. The memory follows me, relentless. Every time the wind picks up, every time a branch taps against the side of the house, every time I hear the faint creak of a floorboard in an empty hallway, I am reminded of that night. The figure waits, patient, hidden just at the edge of perception, ready to return when the storm comes again. The cabin remains empty now, reclaimed slowly by nature. Yet even miles away, I know it waits, lingering in the shadows of storms, in the restless energy of wind and rain. No matter where I go, the memory and the presence remain with me, a reminder that some nights and some storms are doors, and some figures are patient enough to wait for the living to wander too close. Storms are no longer merely weather for me. They are warnings. They are invitations. And some nights, in the restless dark, I can almost hear the soft, deliberate pacing of something waiting just beyond the light, whispering my name, reminding me that it is still there. Story the end. The first drops of rain began in the late afternoon, fat and cold, hammering against the windows of the old farmhouse just outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I had driven out from the city to spend the weekend alone, thinking I could escape the noise and chaos, catch up on some work, and maybe sleep without the usual hum of streetlights in the distance. The house had belonged to my uncle, who had passed several years ago, and my parents had convinced me it would be safe for me to stay there alone. I had expected quiet. I hadn't expected what came next. By 6 o'clock, the sky was dark, heavy with rolling clouds that pressed down on the valley. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters and whipping through the trees that surrounded the property. I unpacked my things in the small bedroom on the second floor, trying to ignore the way the house groaned and creaked as if it were alive, adjusting to the storm. I brewed a cup of coffee and sat near the window, watching the rain slap the ground, lightning briefly illuminating the farm beyond in stark white bursts, followed almost immediately by the rumble of thunder that shook the floors beneath me. Around 7, the power flickered and went out completely. Darkness pressed into the room like a heavy weight. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and turned it on, its narrow beam cutting through the oppressive shadows. The house felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves had moved closer. Every small sound, the groan of a floorboard, the squeak of a hinge, sounded deliberate. That's when I first heard it, a dragging sound, slow and heavy, coming from the hallway outside my room. My stomach tightened. I froze, straining to listen over the wind and rain. Drag, scrape, scrape. It stopped, then started again, a slow, measured rhythm that didn't belong to the storm. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an old shutter swinging, maybe a branch hitting the siding, but the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. I gripped the flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The sound stopped, silence pressed in, and then I heard it, soft and low, unmistakable. Ethan. My heart skipped a beat. I spun, swinging the flashlight, but the hallway was empty. The walls, the floors, the furniture, they were all exactly as they should be. Yet the sensation of being watched pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I knew I had to investigate, though every instinct told me not to. The footsteps began again, slow and heavy, pacing along the hallway toward the stairwell. They paused, then continued, deliberate, echoing with an authority that made my blood run cold. I gripped the railing and began climbing the stairs, flashlight trembling in my hand. The wood groaned under my weight. At the top, the hallway stretched ahead of me in darkness, the doors to the bedrooms closed. At the far end, a sliver of light from a distant window flickered with each bolt of lightning. Shadows danced along the walls in unnatural shapes. And then I saw it, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing at the end of the hall. It didn't move at first, only watched. My chest tightened, breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see a face, only a silhouette outlined in darkness. The voice came again, a whisper that cut through the storm, clear and commanding. Leave. I didn't argue. I ran. Down the hallway, down the stairs, nearly tripping, the flashlight swinging wildly. The storm crashed against the house, rain pounding my skin, wind tearing at my clothes, but I didn't stop. I bolted through the living room and out the front door, my lungs burning, my heart hammering. I didn't look back until I reached my car, soaked to the bone, keys fumbling in my trembling hands. When I finally glanced back, the house sat silent, normal in the daylight, but I knew better. Something had been there. Something still lingered, waiting, patient, in the darkened hallways. I never returned to that house alone. Even years later, when storms roll across Lancaster, I feel the same dread, the same pressure, the same sensation of being watched. On dark, restless nights, I sometimes think I see the tall, thin figure at the top of the stairs, waiting silently, just beyond the reach of the light. Storms are never just storms anymore. Every clap of thunder, every flash of lightning takes me back to that night, to the dragging footsteps, the whispered warning, the shadow that glided silently down the hall. I know now that some things, once they claim a house, never truly leave it. Story the end. The storm came without warning, a sudden surge of wind and rain that slammed against the trees along the winding country road. I was driving alone, the headlights of my old Chevy barely cutting through the sheets of water that fell in relentless torrents. The sky had grown dark by late afternoon, but the clouds now pressed down with a kind of malevolent weight, blotting out every trace of twilight. I had been heading to my uncle's old farmhouse in upstate New York, a place I hadn't visited since childhood, thinking it would be a quiet weekend to escape the city. I wanted isolation, space to write, to think, and maybe to drink without interruption. But the storm made the approach feel anything but peaceful. The narrow gravel driveway twisted through the woods, and every gust of wind made the car sway, rattling in the old frame. A branch whipped across the windshield with a sharp crack, and my heart jumped in my chest. I slowed, gripping the wheel tighter, wishing I had left earlier in the day. The farmhouse finally came into view, sitting on a small hill with the surrounding trees bending violently in the wind. Its porch light flickered weakly, barely illuminating the soaked path ahead. I parked, boots sinking into the wet gravel, and fumbled for the keys. The storm had already soaked me through my jacket, and I felt the chill run straight into my bones. I pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges swallowed by the wind, and stepped into the musty interior. The house smelled of damp wood, old pine, and something I couldn't quite identify, a faint, sweet rot that clung to the corners of the floorboards. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses have smells like that, especially when left empty for months at a time. I turned on the lights, but even their glow could not chase away the oppressive darkness that seemed to cling to every shadowed corner. The storm outside made the walls shiver, and every creak of the floor sounded amplified in the quiet house. I set my bag down and tried to shake off the unease, making coffee and lighting a few candles for warmth. By 9 o'clock, the storm had reached a fevered pitch. Thunder shook the house, and lightning illuminated the windows in sharp, blinding flashes. I was curled on the couch with my notebook, trying to write, when I heard it, a soft tapping at the front door. 3 slow taps, deliberate, followed by a pause, and then 3 more. My heart skipped a beat. No one was supposed to be here. The farmhouse stood alone at the end of the road, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I whispered, "Hello?" but the storm drowned my voice almost instantly. The tapping continued. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. The porch was empty, the wind bending the branches of the surrounding trees violently. Nothing moved. I locked the door and tried to convince myself it was just a branch, though a small voice inside whispered that I was wrong. I returned to the living room, but the storm had made the house feel alive in a way that was wrong. Shadows stretched along the walls, dancing unnaturally in the flickering candlelight. I tried to read, tried to focus on my notebook, but every floorboard creak, every gust of wind rattling the windows made me jump. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the air, and the sense of being watched settled over me like a heavy blanket. Then I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing across the floorboards upstairs. I froze, my chest tightening, my muscles coiled with fear. There should have been no one here. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a cast-iron skillet, and crept toward the staircase. The steps above stopped. Silence. Then came the whisper, soft and low, almost melodic. "Come here." I backed up instinctively, heart hammering. Another flash of lightning illuminated the hallway upstairs, and for a brief instant I saw it, a figure standing at the top of the stairs. Tall, thin, its head tilted unnaturally, long hair plastered to its pale face. Its eyes were empty, black voids, and its presence filled the entire hallway. The lightning faded, and the figure was gone. I stumbled back, nearly falling, and ran to the kitchen, locking the door behind me. I huddled near the counter, gripping the skillet, unable to breathe properly. The storm raged outside, and the house seemed to pulse with a restless energy. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I have no way to know. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful, anxious sleep on the kitchen floor. I woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving only the occasional drip of water from the eaves. I checked each room. Everything appeared normal. The bedrooms were empty, the living room undisturbed, no sign of forced entry, and yet the feeling of being watched did not leave me. Then I saw the footprints. Dark, wet prints leading from the front door to the base of the stairs. I had not been outside. No one had come in. The prints were large and heavy, pressing into the old floorboards. I left immediately, driving into the nearby town, not stopping until I felt the presence begin to fade with distance. Weeks later, I returned to the farmhouse. It was quiet, normal in appearance. The footprints were gone. Everything seemed in place. Yet the oppressive sense of being watched remained, an invisible weight pressing against my chest, reminding me that whatever I had encountered was patient, waiting for the next stormy night to return. Since that night, I never stay alone in isolated houses during storms. I avoid cabins, back roads, and forests when thunderclouds gather. And every storm that rolls through, no matter where I am, carries with it the same restless energy. The sensation of footsteps behind me, the faint whispers brushing my ear, the cold that seeps into my bones, all of it returns with the wind and rain. I have learned to recognize the signs, the flicker of lights, the shadows stretching where they shouldn't, the sudden chill that rises in the air. The figure waits in the storm, always patient, always hidden, observing from just beyond the reach of the light. And I know, deep down, that one day, another storm will bring it closer. It will test its patience again, pacing just out of sight, whispering my name, waiting until I dare to return. Storms are no longer just weather to me. They are warnings. They are invitations. Some nights, when the wind howls and the rain pounds against the windows, I can almost hear the soft, deliberate pacing of something waiting just beyond the light, reminding me that it is still there, patient and restless, waiting for the next time I am alone. Story the end. The first time I realized the storm wasn't just weather was around 4 in the afternoon. I had been driving west from my apartment in Pittsburgh, heading to my aunt's farmhouse outside a small town called Cedar Hill, Pennsylvania. The sky had been gray and heavy all day, but by the time I hit the rolling hills outside town, the clouds were swollen and black, low enough to make the distant ridges disappear. The wind picked up, rattling the car as I navigated the winding back roads, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the countryside in stark, fleeting white. I told myself I was just anxious about driving alone, but a gnawing feeling in my chest told me the storm was more than just rain and wind. By the time I arrived at the farmhouse, the first sheets of rain were hammering against the roof and the sides of the house. The farmhouse had been in my family for generations, old and creaky, with wide porches and narrow hallways that always felt too tight in the dark. I had stayed there as a kid, but being alone as an adult made it feel different, more oppressive, more alive. I carried my bag inside, flicked on the lights, and tried to shake the unease that had settled over me. The storm grew quickly, pounding against the tin roof with a force that made every beam groan and every window rattle. I made coffee, sat near the kitchen window, and tried to focus on my laptop, but the storm seemed to dominate the house. Every flash of lightning turned the living room into a stark, bright stage. Every crash of thunder shook the floorboards beneath me. Then, around 6:30, the power went out. Darkness swallowed the house at once, heavy and suffocating. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter, the weak beam barely cutting through the shadows. That's when I heard it. A dragging sound, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway that led to the bedrooms upstairs. I froze, straining to hear over the storm. Drag, scrape, drag, scrape. It stopped, then started again. I told myself it was a branch blown against the siding or maybe a raccoon trapped inside. But the steps had weight and intention. I gripped the flashlight like a weapon and stepped cautiously toward the stairs. The sound ceased as I reached the base, replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the wind's howl and the rain pounding against the roof. Then I heard it, my name whispered softly, unmistakable, almost in my ear. Ethan. I swung the flashlight wildly. Empty hallway, shadows stretched along the walls, bending unnaturally in the beam. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming to leave, but I couldn't. Something held me there. The footsteps upstairs began again, slow, heavy, measured. I knew the rooms were locked. Nobody should have been there. The sound moved deliberately across the floor, stopped, then resumed. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I gripped the railing and slowly climbed the stairs. Each creak of the wood beneath me was deafening. At the top, the hallway stretched in darkness, the bedroom's doors closed, except one, the one at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. I shone the light toward it. A shadow moved at the far end of the hall, tall, thin, its edges blurred in the flickering light of lightning flashes. My heart stopped. The shape didn't walk. It glided, almost floating toward me. The voice came again, low, sharp, commanding. Leave. I bolted. Down the hall, down the stairs, nearly tripping as the flashlight swung wildly. The storm crashed against the house, rain soaking me instantly as I burst through the front door. My legs carried me to the car, trembling and drenched, my keys fumbling in my wet hands. I glanced back once. The house sat silent, normal in the daylight, but I knew it wasn't empty. I didn't sleep that night. I drove to a motel 20 miles away, watching the storm rage over the hills, every flash of lightning bringing back the shadow, the whisper, the deliberate, gliding footsteps. I never returned to that house alone. Even years later, whenever storms roll through Cedar Hill, the memory presses back, heavy and cold. On dark, restless nights, I sometimes see the figure at the top of the stairs, waiting, patient, silent, beyond the reach of the light. Story the end. The storm had been building all day, heavy clouds rolling in from the west, blotting out the late summer sun until the whole sky turned a bruised, restless gray. By the time evening came, the first low rumbles of thunder shook the windows of my small house on the outskirts of town, a quiet place that sat at the edge of a thick stretch of woods. I'd only been living there for about 2 months, renting it from an older couple who had inherited the property but didn't want to live so far out in the sticks. They'd warned me about how the storms could get out here, strong winds, flooded roads, occasional downed trees, but I just nodded and told them I'd be fine. That night, I wasn't so sure. The wind howled like it had teeth, rattling the shutters against the siding. The power flickered 3 separate times before finally giving out altogether, plunging the house into darkness. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, its weak beam casting long, jittering shadows across the walls, and lit a couple of candles for good measure. With the storm raging outside, I figured there wasn't much to do but wait it out. I curled up on the couch with an old blanket, trying to read by candlelight while the rain battered the roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. Every so often, lightning would crack so close that the entire house shuddered. It was the kind of storm that felt alive, unpredictable, and angry. Around 9, the landline rang. It startled me, mostly because I'd forgotten the house even had one. The owners had mentioned it in passing, how cell service out there was spotty and unreliable, but I hadn't given it much thought. I picked up the phone, pressing it to my ear, but there was nothing but static. No voice, no dial tone, just a faint hiss, like someone breathing through the line. "Hello?" I said, my voice louder than I intended in the quiet of the house. No answer. Just that static and maybe, just maybe, the faintest whisper of something, words I couldn't quite catch. I hung up quickly, shaking my head. Probably just some interference from the storm, I told myself. Maybe a power surge messing with the lines. But as I set the receiver back in its cradle, I had the distinct and unnerving sense that I wasn't alone in the house. It wasn't anything obvious, just that creeping, primal awareness that prickled along the back of my neck. I turned off the flashlight and sat there for a moment in silence, letting the rain and wind fill the space, waiting for some sound, a floorboard creak, a whisper, anything that would tell me I wasn't imagining things. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate thud from upstairs. It wasn't the storm. I knew the house well enough by then to recognize its groans and complaints when the wind pressed against it, and this sound didn't belong. It was a footstep, heavy enough to make the old wood give under its weight. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, listening so hard it hurt. Another step followed, slower this time, like whoever or whatever was up there knew I was downstairs and didn't want to be heard. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the staircase. "Hello?" I called out, hating the tremor in my voice. Silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my pulse hammering in my ears, before convincing myself it had to be the storm again, some loose shutter or tree branch hitting the siding. That had to be it. But when I finally worked up the nerve to climb the stairs, the beam of my flashlight sweeping nervously from one shadow to another, the air on the second floor felt wrong. Heavy. Oppressive. Like stepping into a room where someone had just been arguing but stopped the second you entered. I checked the rooms one by one. My bedroom, the tiny guest room, the narrow bathroom with its cracked tile floor. Nothing. No open windows, no blown-in branches, nothing out of place. And then, just as I started back toward the stairs, I heard it again, directly behind me this time. A slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet, swinging the flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on nothing but the faded wallpaper and the shadow of my own shaking hand. "Who's there?" My voice was thin and tight, barely more than a whisper. No answer. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed on the couch, every light I had flicked on, the candles burning low until they sputtered out. The storm eventually passed, but the house never really quieted. It was as if the silence itself had a presence, like something waiting just beyond the edge of what I could see. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it. Sleep deprivation, stress, maybe even just the power of suggestion from being in an unfamiliar house during a storm. It was easier to believe that than to face the other possibility, that I wasn't alone out there. But the phone kept ringing. Not every night, but often enough that it stopped feeling like coincidence. Always during storms, always with that same static hiss and faint whispering that I couldn't quite make out. Sometimes I thought I could hear my name in it, stretched out and distorted, but when I tried to listen harder, the line would just go dead. One night, after the third call in as many days, I unplugged the phone entirely, thinking that would solve the problem. It didn't. The very next night, just after midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Slow, measured, coming closer. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight I kept by the bed, and waited for the steps to stop. They didn't. They kept coming until they were right outside my door, and then nothing. No retreating footsteps. No door creaks. Just silence, so thick and heavy I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. It wasn't until the first gray light of dawn seeped through the curtains that I found the courage to step into the hallway. Everything looked normal. The narrow runner rug was undisturbed, the pictures on the walls still slightly crooked from when I'd first hung them. But the smell was different. The air was sharp and metallic, like the scent of a coin held too long in your hand, and it lingered for hours after. A week later, during another storm, I finally saw it. I'd been sitting in the living room, half dozing with the TV playing static in the background thanks to the weather when lightning lit up the windows, and I caught a glimpse of something standing at the tree line across the yard. Tall. Too tall to be a person, and still. Perfectly unnaturally still, like a shadow cut out of the night. The next flash of lightning came, and it was gone. I don't remember deciding to leave the house, but I did. I grabbed my keys, shoved my feet into my boots, and drove. I didn't care that the roads were flooding or that the wind tried to rip the car from the pavement. I just needed to be away from that place, away from the feeling that whatever had been in the house with me had finally stepped outside. I stayed at a friend's apartment in town that night, but sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing at the tree line, waiting, watching. The next morning, when I forced myself to drive back, the house felt empty again, like nothing had ever happened. But on the front porch, right against the door, was a single muddy footprint, and it wasn't mine. I moved out a week later. I didn't bother explaining to the owners why I was breaking the lease early. I just handed them the keys and left without looking back. Even now, months later, whenever the wind picks up and the sky turns that same bruised gray, I hear the faint ring of that landline in my head, and I swear I can almost make out the whispers on the other end. Story, the end. It's a stormy Thursday evening in early October when I first realized that something about the old Wilkerson house just didn't sit right. I had moved to rural Pennsylvania only a few months prior, taking up a temporary job as a freelance photographer for documenting abandoned structures and forgotten properties. The town of Haverhill was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the Wilkerson house had long been a subject of hushed gossip. Locals claimed it was cursed, that the last family to live there vanished without explanation decades ago. I had no reason to believe in ghost stories, not really, but there was a compelling aura about the place that drew me in. I arrived in town around 4:30 p.m., the sky already a slate gray that threatened rain. By the time I reached the edge of the property, the wind had picked up, bending the skeletal branches of the trees like something out of a nightmare. The house itself was a sprawling Victorian structure, its paint peeling in long, curling strips, windows dark and hollow. The air smelled faintly of wet soil and decay. I parked my car near the cracked driveway, the tires crunching over loose gravel, and stepped out, immediately wishing I had a better flashlight. The storm clouds rolled in thick, and the first drops of rain began to fall before I even set my camera bag down. The front door was partially ajar. I'd read online that it had been like that for years, but something about it tonight made my stomach tighten. Still, curiosity outweighed caution. I pushed it gently, the old hinges squealing in protest. Inside, the air was cold, damp, and thick with the musty scent of mold and rot. Every step I took echoed through the cavernous interior, and I couldn't help but notice the layer of dust and debris that covered the floorboards. The storm outside intensified, wind lashing against the house, rain beating against the roof in a relentless rhythm. It felt as though the house was alive, breathing around me. I set up my camera in the main hallway, where faded wallpaper peeled in long ribbons from the walls. The staircase leading to the second floor groaned as I ascended, each step threatening to give way. I had my tripod ready, and I began photographing the interior, capturing the remnants of lives once lived. Broken furniture, a tattered armchair, old portraits that seemed to watch me from the walls. One photograph in particular caught my attention. A portrait of a young girl, her eyes unnervingly dark, staring straight through the frame. Something about the way the shadows fell across her face made me shiver, and I almost didn't want to look at it again. By the time I reached the attic, the storm had transformed into a near deluge. Lightning illuminated the room in sudden, violent flashes, each bolt revealing the clutter of old trunks, boxes, and broken furniture. The air here was colder still, and I felt a prickling sensation along the back of my neck. I started taking photos, the sound of the shutter loud in the silence. Then I heard it, a soft thud behind me. I froze, listening. The storm was so loud I almost thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, slower this time, deliberate. My heart pounded, and I swung my flashlight toward the corner. Nothing, just shadows, deep and shifting. I told myself it was probably an animal, mice, maybe, or maybe the house settling. Rational explanations. But then I heard it again, a whisper this time, almost inaudible over the roar of the rain. "Get out." I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Empty. My breathing quickened. I should have left right then, but something, fear, curiosity, adrenaline, kept me rooted to the spot. I took another photograph, the flash illuminating the corner briefly. And for a fleeting second, I thought I saw a figure. A girl, pale, wet, standing just behind the stack of trunks. Then she was gone. The feeling of being watched intensified. Every room I entered seemed to hum with a subtle energy, the kind that presses against your skin and fills your chest with ice. I moved back downstairs, deciding that I would just take some exterior shots and leave. The storm was at its peak now, and lightning striking nearby trees, thunder rattling the windows. I pushed open a side door to the back porch, rain instantly soaking me. As I adjusted my camera, I noticed footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They led from the back door to the edge of the yard and stopped abruptly. And yet, when I glanced at the surrounding area, the field was empty. I called out. No answer. Only the storm responded, its voice angry and overwhelming. By the time I returned to the main hallway, dripping and shivering, the sense of presence had grown unbearable. It wasn't just the girl, I realized. It was something else, something older. The energy in the house was thick, oppressive, almost sentient. My flashlight flickered, and when it came back on, I saw them. Faint shapes, shadowy figures, moving just at the edge of my vision. Always gone when I tried to focus directly on them. Heart racing, I decided to leave through the front door, but the door wouldn't budge. I pulled, yanked, pressed my shoulder against it, and still, nothing. Panic clawed at me. I turned to the hallway, and the temperature dropped dramatically. My breath fogged in the beam of my flashlight. And then I heard it clearly. A child laughing, high-pitched and giddy, echoing off the walls. It wasn't playful, though. It was mocking, sinister. I backed toward the staircase, my eyes scanning for the light of the storm outside. Another flash of lightning revealed her again, the little girl from the portrait, standing at the top of the stairs, her head tilted unnaturally, eyes hollow. I screamed, the sound swallowed by the thunder, and stumbled back. She didn't move toward me. She just stood there, smiling, watching. Suddenly, the house seemed to come alive. Doors slammed shut around me, windows rattled violently, and I felt hands, or something like hands, brushing against my arms, cold and wet, trying to push me back. I fought my way to the back hall, toward a window I had seen earlier. I smashed it with the camera tripod, glass cutting my hands, and climbed through. Rain soaked me instantly. I didn't stop running, not until I reached my car. Slamming the doors, I locked myself inside, breathing heavily, heart hammering. The storm raged, but the house behind me was silent now. Too silent. I drove back to town, shaking, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was sleep deprivation. Maybe the storm had distorted sounds. Maybe it was my imagination, fueled by local legends. But the photographs I had taken told a different story. In every image, shadows twisted unnaturally. In the attic, I captured the girl, faint and translucent, staring directly at the lens. And in the hallway, figures appeared at the periphery, elongated, impossible, watching me with something that was not human. I tried to delete them, tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but the more I looked, the clearer it became. Whatever was in that house, it was real, and it had known I was coming. I didn't return to Haverhill for months. When I finally did, I drove past the Wilkerson house in daylight. It looked empty, decayed, but inert. No wind, no storm, no sense of presence. Just the house, quiet and broken. But that night, the night of the storm, I remembered every detail. The laughter, the shadows, the girl's hollow eyes, and the way the house had breathed around me. I never forgot it. And sometimes when the wind howls through the trees outside my own home, I swear I hear her laughter again, and the whisper of the storm carrying her voice. Get out. Even now, years later, I know she is still there, waiting for the next storm, the next restless soul drawn into her world, where the rain never stops and the shadows never sleep. And I know, without a doubt, that if I ever returned, I would not leave so easily. The Wilkerson house does not forgive, it does not forget, and it watches, always, for anyone foolish enough to enter its doors. Story the end. The rain had been coming down since late afternoon, pounding the roof of my little house on the edge of town so hard it sounded like someone was throwing handfuls of gravel against the siding. By the time night fell, the storm had turned violent, trees thrashing, the wind howling like a freight train, and thunder cracking so close that the walls rattled. I'd never liked nights like that. Growing up in North Carolina, my dad used to say that storms woke up old things that preferred to stay hidden. He'd tell stories when the lights went out, about spirits wandering roads in the rain, or shadows that tapped on your window but disappeared when you opened the curtains. As a kid, I thought it was just his way of scaring me into staying in bed. But that night, I realized maybe there had been some truth to the things he said. The power went out just after 9. I was sitting on the couch with my laptop, trying to focus on emails, when the whole house shuddered and went black. I cursed under my breath, set the laptop aside, and fumbled for the flashlight I kept in the drawer by the door. The beam of light cut through the darkness just enough to see my reflection in the glass of the big living room window, pale, startled, and surrounded by a deep nothing outside. Lightning lit up the backyard, revealing sheets of rain and the twisted silhouette of the oak tree that leaned toward the house like it wanted to collapse right through my roof. I didn't like the way the shadows moved out there. Something about them felt wrong, like they weren't just from the storm. I told myself I was imagining it. It was just another bad night, the kind I'd ridden out dozens of times since moving into that house. But then the phone rang. Not my cell, the landline. I froze. I never used the landline. It had come with the house, some relic from the 70s mounted on the kitchen wall. The only people who ever called it were telemarketers or wrong numbers, and even those had stopped months ago. The shrill ring cut through the storm again, sharp and insistent. I hesitated before crossing the living room and picking up the receiver. Hello? My voice sounded smaller than I meant it to. There was nothing at first, just static, faint and distant like wind blowing through a tunnel. Then, under the static, a voice whispered something, too soft to make out. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to sound firm. The whispering stopped, and the line went dead. I stared at the receiver for a second before hanging it up. My hands were shaking. It had to have been a prank call. Or maybe the storm messed with the line. That made sense, at least that's what I told myself. I tried to go back to the couch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house felt different. Heavier. Every creak of the floorboards made me glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there. Around 10, the rain eased a little, but the wind didn't. The trees outside scraped against the siding like nails on a chalkboard. I lit a couple of candles in the kitchen, thinking the warm glow would make me feel less alone. It didn't. The light flickered with every gust of wind, and the shadows kept stretching, twisting, until they reached corners of the room they shouldn't have. I was sitting at the table when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. No one ever came out here at night, especially not in a storm like that. The knock came again, louder this time. I picked up the flashlight and walked slowly toward the door, my socks silent on the hardwood floor. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I reached for the doorknob, hesitated, then yanked the curtain on the small window beside the door. The porch was empty. Rain lashed against the steps, pooling in the cracked concrete below, but there was no one there. No car headlights, no movement, just the storm and the dark. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the sound had been something falling in the wind. But as I stepped back from the door, I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it sounded like it came from the back of the house. I didn't move for a full minute, just stood there, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. The back door was in the kitchen, a narrow one that opened onto the small deck behind the house, the deck that backed up to the woods. Every instinct told me not to go, to lock the doors, crawl into bed, and wait for the storm to pass. But something else, curiosity maybe, or a strange pull I couldn't explain, made me take one slow step at a time toward the kitchen. The candles flickered violently as I passed, like they were reacting to something unseen. I reached the back door and shined the flashlight through the glass. Nothing. Just rain streaming down the pane, the wet shine of the deck boards and the black wall of trees beyond. I exhaled, a shaky, relieved sound, and turned away. That's when I heard it, clear as day, right behind me. "Don't turn around." The voice was quiet, raspy, and so close it felt like the breath grazed the back of my neck. I spun around, the flashlight beam jerking wildly across the kitchen. No one was there. My knees nearly buckled. I stumbled backward until my spine hit the counter, my chest heaving as I tried to make sense of it. The house was empty. I knew it was. I lived alone. But then the phone rang again, that sharp, shrill ring cutting through the roar of the storm. I didn't want to answer it. God, every part of me screamed not to pick it up. But my feet carried me forward anyway, like I wasn't in control. I lifted the receiver, my hands trembling. The static was louder this time, and underneath it, a voice, clearer now, though still distant. "Don't open the door." My stomach dropped. I slammed the phone down and backed away. And then, like some cruel joke, the knock came again. This time from the front door. Slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The storm outside roared, the house groaned with the wind, and somewhere in the darkness, I swear I heard the floorboards creak like someone was walking down the hallway toward me. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, listening to the storm and the silence in between. When the power finally flickered back on just after midnight, the house flooded with light, but it didn't make me feel any safer. because when I finally found the courage to look, there were wet footprints leading from the back door across the kitchen floor and stopping right where I had been standing when that voice told me not to turn around, and they weren't mine. Story the end. The storm had rolled in just after sunset, the kind of storm that made the world outside seem like something out of a nightmare. Thick clouds pressed low against the sky, and the first flash of lightning cut through the distance just as I was locking the front gate. The forecast had said scattered showers, maybe a little thunder, nothing about this. The rain came down in sheets that glimmered under the flickering streetlight at the end of the long gravel driveway. The old farmhouse sat alone on 3 acres of land, the nearest neighbor almost a mile down the road. Nights like this made the house feel impossibly isolated, swallowed by darkness on every side. I'd been staying at my late uncle's place for about a month. He'd passed away suddenly, leaving the house to my mom, and she'd asked me to stay there while everything got sorted: paperwork, cleaning, repairs. I didn't mind at first. The place was old but solid, with its creaky wooden floors and the faint smell of cedar that lingered in every room. I'd grown up visiting here during summers, running around the yard, catching fireflies with my cousins. Back then, it had felt warm, inviting. Now, being there alone, it was different, too quiet, too still. The wind outside groaned against the siding, and every distant creak inside the house felt louder somehow. That night, as the storm deepened, I settled in the living room with a mug of coffee and the soft hum of the old radio for company. Power outages were common during heavy rain, so I'd lit a couple of candles just in case. I tried to read, but the wind was howling, the rain slamming against the windows in bursts so hard that it felt like something was trying to get in. Every few minutes, the house seemed to shudder, as if unsettled by the violence outside. Around 9, the lights flickered and then went out completely. The room went dark except for the glow of the candles. I sighed, put down the book, and went to check the breaker in the basement. The stairs groaned as I descended, the smell of damp and old wood rising to meet me. The flashlight beam danced across the concrete floor as I stepped carefully, mindful of the uneven spots. The breaker had tripped, same as last week. I flipped it back, but nothing happened. The storm had knocked out the power completely this time. As I started back up the stairs, I froze halfway when I thought I heard something. Soft, quick footsteps across the wooden floor above me. My heart gave a sharp jolt, but I brushed it off. Houses like this were full of noises. Wood expanding, wind slipping through old gaps, branches scraping against the siding. By the time I reached the top step, though, I realized something unsettling. The sound had stopped the moment I stopped moving, like it had been aware of me listening. I climbed the rest of the way quietly, my ears straining in the silence except for the storm outside. The candles in the living room flickered wildly as if stirred by a sudden draft, though the windows were all shut. I told myself it was nothing and went back to the couch, but my eyes kept darting toward the hallway. The house didn't feel empty anymore. By midnight, the storm had grown worse. Lightning flared almost constantly now, illuminating the fields beyond the yard like brief snapshots. The thunder followed close behind, so loud it rattled the glass panes in their frames. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like something was just out of sight. At one point, I thought I heard a whisper, so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it, coming from the direction of the kitchen. When I got up to check, the room was empty, except for the wet streak of water across the linoleum floor near the back door, as though someone had come in from the rain. I locked the door, double-checked it, and sat back down, my nerves taut. That's when I saw it, the shadow in the hallway. For just a second, in the strobe of lightning, there was a figure standing there, tall, still, and unmistakably human-shaped. My breath caught in my throat, and I blinked hard. But when the darkness fell again, the hallway was empty. I told myself I was just tired, that I was letting the storm and the isolation play tricks on me. But then the footsteps came again, slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway toward the living room. The floorboards creaked under weight that wasn't mine. My hands trembled as I grabbed the flashlight, sweeping the beam toward the sound. Nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and noise. Doors that I knew I'd locked creaking open, faint knocks from somewhere upstairs, the whispering growing louder until I couldn't tell if it was real or just the blood pounding in my ears. I didn't sleep. I sat there, rigid, the flashlight clutched so tightly it left red marks in my palm until the first gray light of dawn started to push through the rain. When the storm broke, I convinced myself it had all been my imagination. The isolation, the storm, the old house full of strange acoustics, it all made sense in the daylight. But that night, when the rain started again and the wind began its low moan around the corners of the house, the fear came creeping back, and I started to notice other things. Small things at first. A chair pulled away from the table that I was certain I hadn't moved, a picture frame tilted slightly on the wall. Then bigger things. My keys missing and found hours later on the porch steps, the faint sound of humming upstairs when I knew I was alone, the door to my uncle's old room creaking open, no matter how many times I shut it. One night, maybe a week later, I woke to the sound of someone breathing in my room. It was subtle, shallow, but unmistakable. The kind of sound you only notice when you're in complete darkness, when your senses sharpen because they know something's wrong. I held my breath, straining to hear, and there it was again, closer this time, near the foot of the bed. My hand fumbled for the flashlight on the nightstand, but before I could switch it on, lightning flashed outside, lighting the room for a fraction of a second. In that instant, I saw a figure, tall and motionless, standing at the corner of the room. I froze, too terrified to move, my body rigid under the blanket. When the darkness returned, so did the silence. No breathing, no footsteps, nothing. But I didn't sleep again that night. The days blurred after that. I tried to leave once, packing a bag and telling myself I'd go stay with my mom in town until I could figure things out. But when I reached the end of the driveway, the car wouldn't start. The battery was dead, though it had been fine the day before. I walked back to the house, drenched from the rain, and as I stepped inside, I heard the humming again, soft, melodic, coming from upstairs. It wasn't until the third week that I started to find the notes. Slips of paper, old and yellowed, left in random places. The kitchen counter, the stair railing, under my pillow. Each one had the same shaky handwriting. It's not safe here. One morning, I woke to find one pinned to the inside of my bedroom door. The note just said, "Leave." I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But every time I tried, something stopped me. The car wouldn't start. The road flooded from the endless rain. The phone lines went down. It was as if the house wanted me there, wanted me trapped. The worst night came near the end of my stay. The storm outside was the strongest yet, with winds so fierce the trees bent low over the yard and rain pounding the roof like drum beats. The power had been out for hours, and I was in the kitchen, trying to light another candle when I heard the front door slam open. I froze, the match trembling in my hand, and listened to the unmistakable sound of wet footsteps crossing the foyer floor. Then the humming started again, closer this time, clearer. A woman's voice, low and steady, coming from the base of the stairs. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Lightning lit up the house, and in that flash, I saw it. A figure at the bottom of the stairs, dripping water onto the floor, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Its face, I can't even describe it properly. Hollow eyes, wide and unblinking, staring straight at me. Then darkness again, and the sound of those slow, heavy steps starting up the stairs. I ran. I didn't think. I just bolted out the back door into the storm, the rain blinding me as I stumbled down the driveway. I don't know how long I ran or where I ended up, but I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of my neighbor's porch light through the trees. By the time I convinced someone to drive me back the next morning, the house was quiet, almost peaceful. My bag was still by the door where I dropped it. Nothing seemed out of place, but on the kitchen table in the center of the room, there was a single piece of paper. In that same shaky hand, it said, "You shouldn't have stayed." I left that day and never went back. The house was sold months later, and I've never asked who lives there now. Sometimes, when the storms roll in at night and the wind howls against my windows, I think I hear it again, that faint, steady humming, somewhere just beyond the edge of the noise. Story the end. It had been storming since dusk, the kind of storm that seemed to settle over the town and refuse to move, like a heavy, angry thing that wanted to be felt. The wind rattled the windows of the old house, and the rain came in sheets so thick that the streetlights outside were only hazy blurs through the streaked glass. I sat in the living room, lights dim, the television off, the house feeling larger than it usually did, too quiet between the low growls of thunder and the occasional cracking roar that made my teeth clench. I had lived in that house for just under a year. It wasn't much. A narrow two-story place on the edge of town that I could afford because it had sat on the market for too long. Uh, Bad bones, the realtor had said, though she meant it in the way people talk about an old house that creaks and groans when it settles. I thought I could handle an old place. I liked the character, the quirks, the little things that made the house feel unique, even when friends told me it was too quiet, too isolated, or that they'd never lived somewhere where the closest neighbor was a quarter-mile down a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained. I told myself I liked the quiet. But on nights like this, when the wind pushed against the house like a restless hand and the thunder made the floorboards tremble, that quiet felt less like solitude and more like something watching. By 9, the power flickered and died, plunging the house into shadows. I grabbed the flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer, its beam slicing through the darkness in a thin yellow cone. My phone battery was low, and the storm had knocked out service hours ago. I told myself it was fine. I had candles. I had blankets. It was just another storm. But then the noises started. It began with something subtle, a scrape, faint but distinct, from upstairs. At first, I chalked it up to the wind or maybe the house shifting against the pressure of the storm. I turned the flashlight toward the stairs and stood there for a moment, my breath shallow, before laughing at myself under my breath and shaking my head. "This house makes noise," I whispered to the empty room. "Old wood, loose siding, that's all." But then it came again, louder this time. A dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being moved across the floor above me. My skin prickled. I told myself I'd imagined it, that I'd been too focused on the storm, and my mind had filled the silence with something that wasn't there. Still, I found myself climbing the stairs, flashlight trembling in my hand. The upstairs hallway was narrow, lined with closed doors, 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, all of them dark. I moved slowly, my footsteps muffled against the carpet, my breath loud in my own ears. I paused at the first door, my old bedroom that I barely used anymore except to store boxes I hadn't unpacked since moving in. The dragging noise stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I stepped into the room, flashlight beams sweeping across stacked boxes and a mattress propped against the wall. Nothing looked out of place, but the air felt heavy, as if it had thickened while I was downstairs. I stayed there for a long moment, listening, waiting, but nothing happened. No footsteps, no movement, just the storm outside and the pounding of my own pulse. When I finally turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as the sound of the wood cracking against the frame echoed through the room. My flashlight shook violently as I whipped it around, but there was nothing, no one. The door stood there, shut tight. "Wind," I whispered, but my voice trembled, the word sounding weak even to my own ears. I forced myself to reach for the knob, and when I turned it, the door swung open easily, almost too easily, as if nothing had happened. I went back downstairs, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that I was being ridiculous. I lit a couple of candles in the kitchen, their small flames casting jittery shadows against the walls. But then came the whisper. It was faint at first, so faint I almost thought it was just the storm. A low, drawn-out murmur that seemed to come from somewhere behind me. I froze in the kitchen, every hair on my body standing on end. I turned, slowly, the flashlight beam cutting across the room, but there was nothing, just the sound of rain pounding against the windows and the occasional rattle of wind against the siding. Then I heard it again, closer this time, my name. Not loud, not aggressive, but clear enough that it made my stomach twist. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak, my voice barely a whisper. "Who's there?" Silence. The house seemed to hold its breath. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was hearing things, stress, isolation, the storm amplifying normal sounds. But deep down, I knew better. The house was old, but this wasn't the house. This was something else. I moved back into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, gripping the flashlight so tightly my fingers hurt. The candlelight flickered with every draft that slipped through the old windows. I kept telling myself that when the storm passed, everything would go back to normal, that I'd wake up tomorrow and laugh about how jumpy I'd been. But then the footsteps started. Slow, deliberate, creaking down the stairs. I pointed the flashlight toward the staircase, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might be sick. The beam caught the top of the stairs, the shadows stretching long and thin across the wall. The footsteps stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, muscles locked, waiting for the next sound. When it came, it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, shallow, ragged, coming from just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. "Get out," I whispered, my voice cracking. The breathing stopped. And then, all at once, the house went silent. Not the normal quiet, but a heavy, suffocating stillness that pressed against me from all sides. Even the storm outside seemed to vanish for a moment, the world holding its breath. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, flashlight clutched tight, the candles burning low, until the first light of morning crept through the rain-streaked windows. By the time the storm finally broke, I had convinced myself it was stress, maybe even exhaustion. But that night, when the wind started up again and the rain began to fall, I heard my name whispered from the top of the stairs, and I knew I wasn't alone. Story the end. The rain had been coming down since early evening, a relentless, pounding storm that seemed determined to wash the whole town away. By 9 o'clock, the roads were slick black ribbons reflecting the yellow glow of streetlights, and the wind had picked up so violently that the trees lining the neighborhood bent like they were bowing to something unseen. I was home alone, and I remember thinking how rare that was. My wife, Karen, had taken the kids to her sister's house for the weekend. I had stayed behind, claiming I had too much work to catch up on, but if I was honest with myself, I just wanted a couple of quiet nights to myself. The house felt empty, almost hollow, without the usual chaos of children's laughter, toys clattering on hardwood, or the constant questions about what was for dinner. At first, it felt like a relief. By the time the storm got bad, though, I wasn't so sure. Our house sits near the edge of town, not exactly isolated, but far enough from the main roads that on nights like this, the world feels far away. The nearest house is a good stretch down the road, barely visible through the trees, and with the power flickering the way it was, that distance suddenly felt larger than usual. I'd been in the den, half watching an old movie, the kind I'd seen 100 times, when the first flicker of power made the lights dim and the screen go black for half a second. It came back just as quickly, but it made me tense up. It was just a storm, I told myself. Storms do this. By 10, the rain had intensified, and so had the wind. I could hear it whistling through the small gaps around the windows. A high, keening sound that made the house feel alive. Every so often, a tree branch would scrape against the siding with a sharp screech. The sound grated on my nerves. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until the worst of it would blow through, but the weather alerts on my phone just kept extending the storm warning. Then came the knock. At first, I thought it was just the wind, some branch or loose piece of siding snapping against the house. But then it came again, 3 distinct knocks, sharp and deliberate, on the front door. I froze, the remote slipping from my hand and landing on the couch beside me. No one should have been out there. The storm was brutal, the roads unsafe. And yet, someone was on my porch. I muted the television, the sudden quiet, almost deafening against the sound of rain hammering the roof, and listened. Another set of knocks followed, louder this time. My first thought was that maybe a car had broken down on the road. Maybe someone needed help. Guilt prodded me to move, though every instinct screamed at me to stay where I was. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and edged toward the front door, my socks silent against the hardwood. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding strange, too loud in the silence of the house. No answer. I hesitated by the door, heart thudding against my ribs, and slowly pulled the curtain on the small window beside it. Through the streaked glass, I could see the porch, slick with rain and lit dimly by the swaying porch light. No one was there, just wet wood and the shadow of the rocking chair moving slightly in the wind. I exhaled, shaking my head. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the storm had thrown something against the door. I was about to step away when the knocking came again, loud and fast this time, rattling the woods so hard I jumped. "Who's there?" I shouted, louder now, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The knocking stopped, and then, as if in answer, the porch light flickered and went out, plunging the front of the house into darkness. I backed away from the door slowly, my grip tightening on the flashlight. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I jumped at the vibration. It was just a weather alert, but the timing of it made my skin crawl. I tried to laugh at myself, to chalk it all up to the storm and my own imagination running wild in the empty house. But deep down, I knew better. It started small at first, little things. The sound of footsteps above me, even though the kids' rooms were empty. The faint creak of the stairs as though someone was slowly coming down them. Every time I went to check, flashlight cutting through the darkness, there was nothing there. Just the hum of the storm outside and the quiet, tense stillness of the house. By midnight, the power went out completely. The house plunged into pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I lit the candles we kept in the kitchen drawer, their warm light flickering and dancing across the walls. It should have made me feel better, but instead it made the shadows seem deeper, more alive. I tried to go back to the den, to the couch, to wait out the storm with the illusion of calm. But the moment I sat down, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were unmistakable, slow and deliberate, coming from the upstairs hallway. I froze, every muscle in my body locked tight. The kids weren't home. No one else should have been here. "Karen?" I called out, my voice trembling despite myself. "Is that you?" Silence. The footsteps stopped. I told myself I had to check, that it was probably nothing, but my legs felt heavy as I climbed the stairs, candle in one hand and flashlight in the other. The beam of the light cut through the darkness ahead of me, landing on the pictures lining the wall, the kids' school portraits, a family vacation photo from last summer. Everything looked normal, too normal. At the top of the stairs, I paused. The hallway stretched out in front of me, empty and still, the doors to the bedrooms all slightly ajar. I stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, so soft I almost thought it was the wind, but it was there. A low, drawn-out whisper, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I froze, straining to hear, but the whispering stopped as quickly as it started. I moved down the hallway, one room at a time, checking each one. The kids' rooms were empty, the beds neatly made, the toys untouched. Our bedroom was the same. But when I reached the last door, the small guest room at the end of the hall, I noticed something. The door, which I always kept closed, was cracked open. Just an inch, but enough. I swallowed hard, hand shaking slightly as I reached for the knob and pushed it open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, and the air inside was cold. Much colder than the rest of the house. I stepped inside, flashlight beam sweeping the corners. Nothing. Just the neatly made bed, the dresser, the small desk we never really used. And then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking wildly in my grip, and yanked at the knob. It wouldn't budge. It felt like someone was holding it from the other side, keeping me in. "Hello?" My voice cracked. "Who's there?" No answer. And then I felt it. A hand, ice cold and clammy, brushing against the back of my neck. I screamed, jerking forward and twisting toward the spot where I'd felt it, the flashlight beam darting across the room. Nothing. Just empty air. The door flew open then, so suddenly it hit the wall with a crack. I bolted, nearly tripping over my own feet as I tore down the hallway and down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was back in the den, my back pressed to the wall, candlelight flickering wildly in the drafty room. And then, just when I thought maybe it was over, I heard it again. Knocking. Not at the front door this time. From inside the house. The sound echoed through the walls, sharp and deliberate, moving from room to room like something, or someone, was walking through the house, announcing itself with each knock. I wanted to leave. God, I wanted to grab my keys and run out into the storm, but something in me knew that wouldn't help. Whatever it wasn't outside. It was here. Story the end. The storm hit just after sunset, rolling across the sky in heavy, black clouds that swallowed the last of the fading light. I had been driving for hours along backcountry roads in rural Pennsylvania, heading toward a small cabin my grandfather had left me years ago. a place tucked deep in the woods where cell service didn't exist and the world seemed to vanish. I wanted solitude, a chance to clear my head, maybe finish some writing I'd been putting off. But as the wind picked up and the rain began to lash against my windshield, I realized this weekend might not be the escape I had hoped for. The narrow road twisted and turned through dense forests, slick with rain, the headlights cutting through the sheets of water in uneven beams. A sudden gust of wind made the car sway, and a branch slammed against the hood with a sharp crack. My heart jumped, and I pressed the accelerator a little too hard, desperate to reach the safety of the cabin. When it finally came into view, its dark silhouette against the stormy sky looked almost menacing. The porch light flickered weakly, struggling against the rain, and the whole place seemed smaller, more fragile than I remembered. I parked, boots sinking into the mud, and fumbled for the keys. My jacket was already soaked through, chilling me to the bone. The door resisted at first, then creaked open, letting me into the musty, dimly lit interior. The smell of damp wood and old pine filled the air, mingled with a faint trace of something else. Something sour, almost metallic. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house, left unused for months. I dropped my bag and switched on the lamps, but the warm glow barely reached the corners of the room, where shadows seemed to cling unnaturally. I sat up near the fireplace, hoping to shake off the unease, and tried to focus on a notebook I had brought to write in. The storm outside roared against the cabin, each gust rattling the windows, each crack of thunder vibrating through the floor. The old house responded with its own noises, floorboards creaking, the roof groaning, and an occasional soft thump, almost imperceptible beneath the storm's noise. Around 9 o'clock, I heard it, a soft knocking at the door. 3 deliberate, slow taps. I froze. There was no one else for miles. My voice caught in my throat as I whispered, "Hello?" The knocks came again, slow, insistent. I swallowed hard and went to the door, flashlight in hand. Outside, the porch was empty, rain slashing sideways through the wind, branches thrashing violently. Nothing moved. I locked the door, telling myself it was the wind or a branch, though every instinct screamed that it wasn't. I returned to the living room, trying to focus on my notebook, but I couldn't concentrate. Every floorboard creak made me jump, and the shadows seemed to shift just out of the corner of my eye. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply, my breath fogging in the air. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the floor above me. My heart pounded, every muscle taut with fear. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast-iron skillet from the kitchen, and edged toward the staircase. The steps above stopped. Silence. Then came a whisper, soft and low. "Come here." I stumbled back, nearly falling. Another flash of lightning illuminated the upstairs hallway, and I saw it. A figure at the top of the stairs, tall and thin, head tilted unnaturally, long wet hair plastered to a pale, almost gray face. Its eyes were black, empty, and fixed on me in a way that made it impossible to look away. The lightning faded, and it was gone. I ran to the kitchen, locking the door behind me, curling into a corner with the skillet. Hours or maybe minutes passed, though I can't say for certain. The storm continued to batter the house, but inside, the air was heavy, charged. Exhaustion finally claimed me, and I slept fitfully on the kitchen floor, half dreaming, half listening to the house's subtle, unsettling noises. Morning came gray and rainy. I checked each room. Everything appeared normal, untouched. The bedrooms, living room, kitchen, all undisturbed. Yet the sense of being watched persisted. Then I saw the footprints. Dark, wet, leading from the front door to the base of the stairs. I had not been outside. No one had entered. The prints were too large, deliberate. I left immediately, driving to the nearest town, seeking lights, warmth, human presence. Weeks later, I returned, hoping the memory had played tricks on me. The cabin seemed normal, empty, quiet. The footprints were gone, but the oppressive feeling remained. Since that night, I avoid isolated houses during storms. The memory follows me relentlessly. Every gust of wind, every roll of thunder brings it back. The soft pacing of footsteps, whispers in the corners of the room, shadows that seem alive. Storms are no longer merely weather. They are warnings, invitations. The farmhouse still stands, abandoned most of the year, reclaimed slowly by nature. Yet I know, even from miles away, that the presence waits there, patient, silent, hidden, watching. And I know that one day another storm will roll in, heavy and restless, and it will beckon. I will feel it again. The cold, the whispers, the pacing footsteps, always just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for the next time I am alone. Storms have a different meaning now. They are not merely rain and wind. They are signals, harbingers. When thunder rattles the windows, when the wind shakes the trees, I feel it. The same restless energy that filled that cabin years ago. I have learned to read the signs, the flicker of lights, the shiver of floorboards, the cold that rises in the air when no one else is near. The figure waits in the storm, patient, silent, and unrelenting. I avoid those back roads, those country lanes where storms sweep through the trees. I avoid the cabins, the forests, the abandoned houses. But the memory follows me, as vivid as the day it happened. I know that one day, when the night is dark and the storm is at its fiercest, the presence will return. And when it does, it will be patient, silent, and watching, pacing just out of sight, whispering my name, waiting for me to dare to return. Storms are warnings. Storms are invitations, and every time the wind rattles the trees, every time the rain drums against the roof, I feel the soft, deliberate pacing of something waiting, reminding me that it is still there, patient and unforgotten. Story, the end.